our first speaker for today, and she will give our talk and kind of launch us, really launch the workshop, but then also, in a sense, launch the Hmong Studies Initiative. So I'm very happy to welcome Chong Mua, who is a PhD candidate in the History Department here at UW-Madison, working on her dissertation that explores Hmong cultural production as homemaking and non-state forms of belonging. She also teaches Hmong Studies courses in the Asian American Studies program at UW-Madison. And just a note here, she's the winner of the Huggins Quarles Award for her study of Hmong refugee settlements in her dissertation. And the title of her dissertation, I just wanted to tell you, is very cool. Refugee Cosmopolitanism, Hmong Refugeeism, and a Critical Stateless Perspective. And that is going to be a very exciting project that she is very advanced on at this time. So her talk will be kind of an interactive workshop that uses close reading of Hmong literature and or folk tales to explore what belonging means to Hmong people. It will introduce the concepts of statelessness and oral literacy and how these relate to Hmong perceptions of home and belonging. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chong Mua to give our first presentation.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you for waking up. This is earlier than I'm used to, so I'm really happy to see all your faces here. And in honor of the workshop today, I'm wearing one of my favorite sweaters, which says Hmong 1975. You can't see. To go with the theme today. So today, this morning, I thought that instead of me droning on and on to you guys about Hmong history or giving you a lecture, we will do something a little bit interactive, and hopefully that'll help all of us wake up, in addition to the latte that I have this morning with me. So, so let us go ahead and maybe get started. Let me pass these things out, and then we will maybe do the activity, and I think we might be okay. I think I should be able to handle this. And then I will be sort of moving around. And if you can't hear me, then please let me know so I could use more of my outside voice. There's two things. We may not get to reading all of it. And let's see, there's something yes, this is going to feel like you when you were in my class. Right, so the first thing I want us to do is, maybe we'll read, let's do the folktale first, and if we have time, we'll do the sort of, the other story that is on the other page. And so let me give you all like 5-ish minutes to read the folktale. This folktale exists in many forms. This is just one version of it, and this is the easiest version that I printed out for all of us today. So let me give you 5 minutes to read it, and then we will come back and discuss it, do a close reading, and then hopefully I will give you a couple of takeaways at the end, and that'll be all for our interactive workshop. Does anyone need a few more minutes for the folktale at least? Okay. 2 more minutes and then we will go on to discussing it as a group. All right, so it looks like most of us or all of us have finished reading at least once over the folktale. We're gonna do discussion through Mentimeter, and I'm sure all of you educators are familiar with Mentimeter. So if you all could, on your device, whether it's your laptop or your cell phone, we'll go to menti.com and then punch in the code 234800004, and that'll get you to the slides. And the first slide, or the first activity we're going to do is sort of doing a class brainstorm on what elements you found interesting, thought-provoking, and or familiar. And so once you put in your answer, it's going to show up there on the screen. And all of these answers are anonymous, but I'm going to ask folks to share out loud what they thought was interesting, thought-provoking, and or familiar.
Do you have a password for the Wi-Fi?
I think you just open your browser, you just have to like accept the terms for the yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And so once you're done with your entry onto the Mentimeter slide, go ahead and read the other entries up there and sort of see what other folks in the classroom are also saying. right, so we're having, there are a lot of great responses on the, up there on the slide. And so let me give, all right, so there's, it looks like most, if not all of us, have contributed to the Menti board. Let me go ahead and now ask folks to share out loud. So you can share out loud what you wrote or other thoughts you're having in terms of this folktale and what you notice about what you find interesting, thought-provoking, and/or familiar. Or if there are other questions you're wondering about after reading this folktale that relates to sort of Hmong interest or Hmong worldview or Hmong perspectives. All right, who wants to share out loud either what they wrote or other thoughts they have as we're starting to discuss the folktale? Yes, go ahead. What's your name?
Sarah,
Sarah, go ahead.
I'm very thought-provoked. So I found it interesting that the brother lied and tricked his sister, but it made me wonder what was his motivation to be so persistent about it. So that's where I am.
Okay, good question, right? And I think that's something that we could all think about. Not that there is a, we don't know if there's an answer, but I think we could all sort of think about what might be his motivations for being so persistent to the fact where he sort of becomes his own atlas, right? And he pushes he manipulates, right, the situation. Thank you, Sarah, for that question. Go ahead. What's your name?
Samantha.
Samantha, go ahead.
So on the first page, like in the second to last paragraph, I was getting a little bit like freaked out. I was like, oh no, like he's gonna trick her into this. But the first sentence in that paragraph, in the morning the sister said that it'd be too bad there was no one to come along as a witness. I figured that witness might have two different meanings. So like first you have the idea like she wants someone to like witness and like be like, oh yeah, those stones got there on their own. Or like the witness to a marriage. So I was hoping it was the second one and that she was more consenting to the idea than we were led to believe. So that's what I was hoping.
Thank you for sharing that, Samantha. And I think we could maybe think about that too. And someone put up there, they're wondering about the sky people. So I think that is also an interesting thing to add to what Samantha just brought up. All right, other folks want to share out loud what they put up on the board or other things that they're thinking now that we've had some time to marinate on the folktale and our thoughts on it. Yes?
Well, I was wondering, I didn't realize we should write it in here. Like, I was wondering about like why so many flood stories have like a reason why the flood happened. And I was wondering what the reason was in this one and like who directed it or what directed it.
Yeah, and that's not really apparent in this version of this story, right? And I would then also, that makes me think about if all the other stories of floods also have an apparent reason, right, for why the flood happens. And I think a lot of people put up there that it does remind them of other stories that they know about, which I think is also an interesting point for us to think about. And I don't know if many of you who may or may not know anything about Hmong, that you read this and you're like, oh, this sounds familiar already, right? And so I think that's an interesting point too. And for other folks who might know other flood-like stories or creations or origin stories, you can also share if in those stories everything is also, if there's a reason for everything, right? Or are other things left up to interpretation or left to, for you to sort of fill in the blank, right? So, Kathy, thank you for that. All right, any other folks want to share? Yes, go ahead. What's your name?
I go by Magda.
Magda.
Okay. Both characters are kind of very stereotype. Means the man is like selfish, okay, marry, like have sex, and she's like the voice of the like the moral or more like kind of the good and bad. No, it's like, no, we cannot do this. Means, yeah, folktales kind of reproduce the stereotypes, and we have to be careful. Actually, it was a very popular book written in Catalan, which is my culture, and kind of same as story, but it was used to explain like the body development and the attraction and the sexual, and because it's like, I don't think they are brother and sister, there's a boy and a girl, that they are the only ones left behind, everybody has died, and then they kind of recognize the body changes, means I think they are like 10 or 12, and then of course time goes by and then they become like more adults, and it's like a different way to kind of the same story but in a different way, used in a different way.
Thank you, Magda, and thank you for sharing that about your Catalan heritage. Yeah, so I think what can we glean from here about gender, right? What sort of how gender sort of functions maybe in the Hmong perspective. And it's not a surprise that you could say, or you can glean that Hmong also, like many societies in the world, is patriarchal, and maybe you can sort of see some of that, right, in this sort of very short version of one of the creation stories. Yes, your name?
My name's Cabby.
Cabby?
Yeah. I was wondering about the folktale because I've read folktales. I'm Korean folktales as well, and they have the aspect of a trickster, and sometimes the trickster is seen as negative, like you're too clever for your own good, and sometimes the trickster is seen as something that's positive. And I'm just wondering I mean, this is a 2022 audience looking at this folk story, but I do wonder if it wasn't a 2022 audience, like if our lens would be different and how we would view the boy, in terms of like, is he being clever or is he being deceitful? And I'm just wondering what was the intent and how audiences might have received it like 40, 50, 100 years ago versus now. Because when I looked at it, I kind of cringed, but then I don't know whether that was the intent of this or not. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good question for us to think about. How do we read these things that come from a long time ago, and then how do we represent it to an audience, right?
Yeah.
How do we represent it to K through 12 students, and then how do we represent it to maybe college kids, and then how am I presenting it to you all today, right? And asking us to think about things. And I think the other question I would also add to what you're asking is sort of the end justifying the means.
Right.
And in Hmong folks sort of 100 years ago, they're telling this story. How do they perceive the actions of the brother, and does it justify society's goals, right? If it is to repopulate the world, and this was the only way, or the only way that he sees it, right? Then maybe we're like, oh, what kind of flexibility do we give that? But today, how do we sort of complicate that a little bit? How do we bring in gender, right? How do we bring in roles of tricksters, right? And what function they have in society in general? I'm thinking of like court jesters, right? If we're thinking about, medieval Europe, right? And sort of the role of those sort of different archetypes in stories, right? And how we tell stories, and what the function of, how do we introduce different kinds of societal roles, right? And I think the trickster is an interesting one, especially in sort of more oral sort of societies, right? How do you sort of make sense, right, of why these figures, right, are used every so often, right, as a way to move things forward? Yes, go ahead.
I'm Nam. I just wanted to build off of the previous comment by Cabby and what you just said. I think it's important to think about that cultural context, because we have questions in terms of interpretation for motivations of the brother, for instance. But if we think about, for example, why the flood happened in the first place, right? We don't know, obviously, but to consider the actions within that cultural context, is there a feeling of obligation on behalf of the brother? That perhaps if they're the last two people in the world, there is some sense of obligation to humanity, whatever the case might be. But it brings up this larger issue about the cultural lens that we use to interpret. So it might be 2022, or it might be the United States, but it could be a completely different perspective depending on the larger cultural context that we're talking about.
Yes. Thank you for reminding us, right, of what context it is, and how do I teach it as someone who is Hmong, who might be familiar to some of these, and then how might you all try to teach it in your classrooms, and from the context of all the knowledge that you all have, right, as teachers, as learners, and as educators, and then how do we make sort of comparisons across sort of different stories as a way to draw out what might be important, right, or what are the questions we could ask. And I think the fact that we all have a lot of questions from reading this, I think that's part of the point too, right, is how do we ask questions of what we read, and I think that's one of the valuable things about, you know, doing something like this and having sort of folks sort of, what do you think, what are other questions you have, and then maybe what are some answers we all might be able to come up with that sort of make sense within the context of the story that we're given, not that they're right or wrong, right, but how do we generate something together. All right, let's
Can I
do,
say something?
yes, go ahead.
I was just thinking, I'm Sandra, I'm a science teacher, and these stories make me think about how people in the past confronted environmental problems like flooding, and what they, like this shows their relationship to nature. When it talks about the seed, the baby seed, that animals were created as well from that seed, and it kind of makes me think about in the present, like how are we as a society and as with different cultural views are going to be confronting the environmental challenges of the present.
Yes, thank you, Sandra, for that. I'm not a STEM person, so I haven't thought about it in the STEM lens, but I think that's a great perspective to bring up, right? So how do we use this to teach environmental science? How do we use this to, because I think we don't often think of folktales or creation stories or origin stories as a way to introduce them to STEM, or how do you introduce students to the environment, what questions we ask about relationships to sort of non-human entities, right? And so if this story is saying that humans and plants and rocks and everything sort of come from one sort of biological blob, right, which is kind of what the baby is presented as, then that's a powerful way to think about, right? How do we take care of ourselves as well as the environment? So thank you for that. The next time I teach that, I'm going to ask the STEM question. Okay, so this is what I also want us to sort of get at is how do we talk about home and belonging then, which is you know what I have in my title for us today of my talk. And so the next question I would ask us after this sort of very generative discussion on what we think and questions we're asking about the story is then, what does this story say about Hmong origins or where Hmong people might come from? And this is us putting on our interpretive hats and also maybe our critical thinking hats. And so once you are ready, you can put your answer up there, and then we'll do a similar thing where we share out loud what we're thinking. so once you're done putting up your thoughts, also read what everyone else is saying, just to take a temperature of what we're all collectively coming up with in terms of this question. All right, in the interest of time, let me ask one or two folks to share out loud either what they put up here or other thoughts they're having now as we're moving on to this second question about this folktale that we just read. All right, who wants to share out loud before we move on? Yes, go ahead.
I'm Kathy. So I am Hmong, and this is the first I've heard of this story. So I'm learning all with you guys, and I'm like, oh, that's cool, right? Like, this is an interesting story. So I think that, I just wanted to share that even though I am Hmong, doesn't necessarily mean that I know these folktales and have heard these before. And so this is my first time here.
Yes, I am the same as you, Kathy. I did not come from a family that told folktales or stories. And so I didn't learn all of these until I became interested in studying Hmong stuff. So I'm with you on that. Yeah, go ahead. Was that a hand?
Kind of. My name's Brian. I guess I have more of a question of timeline.
Yeah.
I'm sure this is all oral tradition that was written, later on, but was looking at the origin or Hmong origin, was there Christian influence from colonization or colonizing or evangelizing, where stories were embedded from that, or does it predate or run parallel? Is there any timeline on the folktale or?
Yeah, good question. So I don't know how sort of old the story is, right? All I know is that there are slightly different versions. And to your question about chronology, there are some more updated versions of some of this that sort of have more what we might recognize as more sort of Christian influence. Even though there's the flood, even though we have the idea of super beings, right, of the pair, right, which some of you already alluded in the last slide to Adam and Eve, right, that sort of the Garden of Eden story. But there are other sort of versions that do that make references to sort of being here in the West, and that I would guess does come from influences of Christianity or missionaries in Southeast Asia. And so in the Hmong case, right, I believe missionaries made contact somewhere in the late 1800s, and those were, some of them were, at least in the context of Laos, it's French missionaries, right? And then you also have other missionaries who were in China as well. I would guess that versions of this story predate, right, contact with missionaries, but sort of how much missionaries or sort of Western thinking has sort of influenced the way that these sort of circulate now. I'm not so sure as to that because there are sort of just slightly different versions of these. But what has sort of been a common theme is, right, the pair of the brother and sisters, the flood, right, and that they sort of have this amorphous baby and that Hmong clan sort of come out of it. And then the other details, right, sort of vary here and there. All right, so there are a lot of good stuff up here, but so keep this in mind. I'm gonna move us back to so I think what we're already getting at, some of the questions on the second slide is sort of that Hmong folks come from a pair, Hmong folks sort of come from, one origin, which is that amorphous baby. And so this folktale, why I like sort of starting with it, because it introduces two really important frameworks when we're thinking about Hmong history or Hmong studies. One of them is statelessness, right? when we're talking about where Hmong people come from, right, this origin, this creation story, doesn't really say a place, right, but it does give us an origin point, right, or an access point, or a creation point, right? And so I think it does get us to think about this idea of statelessness, right, that Hmong folks don't have a homeland, and this is a historical condition. There are, of course, stories that Hmong people used to have a kingdom, a king, and a homeland somewhere, right, but that has sort of been lost over time, and it's sort of unclear where or what that might be. So the idea of statelessness, right? And then this also means that Hmong history, right, Hmong studies, the idea of multiple displacements, right, is also an important thing for us to think about when we're sort of teaching it or when we're sort of trying to think about the context of why Hmong folks sort of might act, right, might make the choices that they did. In the same way that we're questioning, right, why the brother did what the brother did. And the sister, can we say that the sister doesn't care about humankind? We also can't say that either, right? Because the story doesn't, have some of those elements for us to think about. And then the second thing that this folktale gets us to about frameworks for Hmong studies is the idea of oral literacy. Right? Hmong society has largely been an oral society until more recently, and so this means that just simply that knowledge, history, traditions, customs, all were transmitted via oral traditions, and we're seeing one of the sort of products of that, right, in this folktale that we're reading today. But we're reading it in text form, and we're also reading it in English, right? And so we can sort of think about the journey, right, that this oral folktale had to make before it got to us today. And that is part of the oral literacy, right, that exists within Hmong society, and then how it has sort of transformed here, at least in the United States, to a version in which we can all sort of consume and collectively think about. And if you do speak Hmong and understand Hmong, and when you hear this, it is a different experience, right? And so to sort of think about all the forms, right, of knowledge, right, that exists and sort of how it sort of gets transmitted. And so these are the two important frameworks that I want you all to sort of think about when you're thinking about how do you incorporate sort of Hmong stuff maybe into your curriculum or the lessons or the units, right, that you all sort of teach in the various disciplines that you all are teaching from. And everyone sort of already got a lot of this from our discussion, right? So I think that was really, really great. Let's see. So I think what's really interesting for us, and sort of just coming off of those two frameworks, is that it allows, so if you use Hmong studies, if you incorporate Hmong stuff, one of the great things is it allows us to rethink what belonging is. And so if we just simply define belonging as how you make sense of your environment, then we're used to the question of where you are from, right? But I think what Hmong studies also allows us to ask is who are you from, right? If there is no where, then if we look at the creation story, then the who becomes sort of the main question that we should also ask too. And the where and the who, I think, are equally important for us to ask. But nowadays, in this era of nation states, right, we're used to asking where, and I'm encouraging all of us to ask who, right, also ask the question. And not just family, right, but how to rethink kinship, right, not only to human relationships, right, but also to other parts, to other sort of entities around us. So in terms of Hmong studies, I think the importance of asking who are you from allows us to ask all of these questions of ourselves and also of our students. So asking what relationships, right, are important to you, who, right, are the folks, right, that build up who you are and what makes you important. How do these people, right, build a world in which you feel all of the things that belonging should give us, which is safety, nurturing, value, right, love, And then I think the other big question that we all always wonder about is, how do we know we're part of someone else's belonging, right? And that is sort of a reciprocal relationship, right? I can claim I belong to, whatever entity, but how do they show me also, right, that I'm also part of it? So we can think about it in the context of Madison, right? How do we claim that we're Madisonians, or that we live here, or that we're from here? Maybe because I'm a Badger, right? Or I have, an address or my zip code, right? But how does Madison show me, right, that I'm also part of the Madison community? And that all may have varying answers depending on maybe what part of Madison you are in, or what space you enter, what institutions, right? What community spaces that you sort of move in and out of every day. Are we at 9:40? Okay, so we have 5 more minutes, right? And so I think what I wanted to do for the last part is to think of how would you, if I asked you who are you from, how would you answer that question? And so while you think of how you answer who you're from, I'm going to give you examples of how I answer this question and how we can think about it in broad terms, right? So if you ask me who I'm from, the names listed in the magenta, those are all my grandmothers and my aunties and my sisters, because in sort of patriarchal societies, when we say who we're from, we're mostly talking about our father's side of the family, and we never conjure up or mention, right, these women that we come from. So I'm listing all of their names, and I'm listing them in Hmong, right, because these are the names that their mothers and grandmothers gave them, and these are the names that their Hmong spirits would recognize, right, when you call them home. So those are the women that I'm from. The other who that I'm from is, yes, I am from Harry Potter, because I love reading, right? And so how am I from Harry Potter? I'm from Harry Potter because I love the themes of the series, right? The themes is about love, it's about friendship, and it's about how young people can make a difference in the world, and how young people who love each other, who have great friendships, can defeat evil. Right? And I think that is a powerful story. And let's all just sort of acknowledge that Hermione is the real hero of the series, and Ron and Harry are just lucky dudes, right? So I think that's also an interesting story for me to tell where I'm from. And then the other folks that I'm from is all of these sort of great Hmong American writers, right? Who are writing, who are capturing the Hmong story, right? Who are continuing that legacy of oral traditions in a different way, right, here in the United States, right? And so if you have not read any of these books, I would really recommend them, right, and these are also great teaching tools too for different parts or different grade levels as well. And so I was going to ask, the last thing I wanted to ask actually is, actually, we'll just stay here. So if I ask, who are you from? How would you answer that question? Does anyone want to take a stab at it? We were going to do it on Menti and have people share out, but maybe in the interest of time, maybe I'll just ask now to see if someone has a way of conceiving of how you might answer this question.
I want to ask you, can you please read the names? How you
Yes, yes, yes. So the women that I'm from is Mai, Tai Lao Lia, Tai Huan Ju. Yami, that's my mother's name. And these are all my sisters. Bi, Mo, Yo, Tai, Mai Nia, and Go Sheng.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking me to call them out loud. All right, we have a couple minutes left. Does anyone have a burning desire to answer this question and give us their version of who they're from? Broadly conceived, right? You can talk about your family, you can talk about your pet. You can talk about your favorite plant. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so when I think of who I'm from, I start with my parents, my grandparents, but what this is also highlighting and we're talking about in my family is a lack of actually knowing in terms of like ancestry and where people are from, and we're starting to want to look more into this. But so that's kind of what it brings up for me is who, you know, when I go further back, like, we need to figure this out in my family.
Yes, right, how do you,
How do you trace it?
how do you trace it, and how important is knowing how far you go back? How important is that to you, right? Or are you thinking of every generation as a new sort of node, right? And are you okay with not knowing all the nodes that go back? Right, so these are all sort of things we have to sort of make peace with, because that tracing journey is not possible for everyone. And here I'm mostly thinking of Hmong folks too, right? Ancestry.com is not going to help me, you know, trace my Hmong family, right? That's a different process, right? And so how do I make peace with that? And what do we leave, right, for our children and for the next generation if we're thinking about this question of who as well as where? And I think we are at time, but I am around if you have any burning questions. I hope you all sort of take something from this, even though it wasn't, I did drone to you guys on about like, what is Hmong history? What do you need to know about Hmong history? That's because I believe all of you can read what's out there and you can incorporate those things into your own teachings. But I wanted us to do today was to collectively think about a couple of important ideas, and I hope we have done that, and I think we have done that, and I hope you think we've done that as well. So thank you all so much for your energy this morning.
Thank you so much. I just want to know about a couple things very quickly. First of all, Chong has been a terrific ally in our Southeast Asian Studies program and doing outreach. She's given a couple of talks for previous workshops for the other years. She is an historian, and if you want to know history and accurate history, please talk to her, because she not only knows the accurate and detailed history of Hmong and Southeast Asian coming to America and much more, teaches it, but she also knows how to navigate some of the minefields of talking about Hmong history, which you should all be aware of, by the way. Second, this is a book that she just had up on the screen. This is Gago Le Yang, who